The sound of the sea that morning was different. The diving team had left very early, when the sky still mixed shades of gray with the last streaks of deep blue. The shy sun appeared behind thin clouds, softly illuminating the waters of the Atlantic. Ocean. The support vessel rocked slowly on the waves, while the captain observed the horizon with that distant look of someone who has seen many things come back to the surface, and some that should have remained hidden. That day's mission was one of many that the research group had been carrying out for years, to explore submerged wreckage, catalog objects, and, occasionally, collect something that might tell a story. The site had been identified by radar a few weeks earlier. The depth was great, but not unusual. The wreckage was there, silent, resting like a dormant steel skeleton nearly 100 meters below the surface. A medium-sized ship dating from the 1980s mysteriously disappeared on a cruise voyage that never reached its final destination. As they descended, the divers were greeted by a serene darkness. The lights on their suits revealed twisted parts of the vessel, time-worn corridors, half-open doors that seemed to whisper forgotten stories, ladders where rust danced beneath the current. Everything was calm, like an underwater dream. There was no rush. There was no fear. Just the steady sound of controlled breathing and the gentle hum of equipment. It was the second diver, Julio, who found the object. Among the fragments of wood and metal, very close to the captain's cabin, there was a closed rectangular box wrapped in worn leather straps. Apparently protected by some kind of waxed cloth, it seemed intact. He approached it carefully, releasing a light jet of air to blow away the dust at the bottom. The letters were almost illegible, but one inscription stood the test of time. On board. Log, Voyage 23. Upon returning to the surface, the atmosphere on the ship changed slightly. No one commented, but everyone felt it. The box was opened gently. Inside, protected by layers of dry cloth and sealed plastic, was a logbook with black leather cover and gold edges. There were no signs of mold, no yellowed pages. It was as if it had been saved the night before. The first page was simple, unadorned, with firm, elegant handwriting. Logbook, Atlantida Cruise Departure Date, March 7th, 1984. Name of responsible. Officer, Rafael Lacerda. If anyone is reading this, it means that the sea has decided to return our history. May it be read with respect. Not everything should be understood, but everything needs to be remembered. The crew was silent for a few moments. The wind blows gently through the sails of the boat, as if the ocean itself is patiently waiting for the moment when the next pages will be turned. And that's how it all began, with a diary rescued from the bottom of the sea, with words written by hands that perhaps had never left there, with a story that did not shout, but whispered, like the current, in the ear of whoever dared to listen. The next pages of the diary were soft, almost poetic. The words glided calmly, as if the author had written each line under the light ocean breeze without any rush. The paper carried a strange serenity, like someone who begins a journey without knowing that they are heading towards something far beyond what the eyes can see. The officer in charge, Rafael Lacerda, began his story like many others who had already been on similar ships. A new job, a new route. Aboard the Cruzeiro Atlantida, he had been assigned to accompany the crew on a tourist route that would depart from Rio de Janeiro towards the African coast, with stops at paradisiacal spots along the way. It was a crossing that would last 20 days in total. Something simple, routine. A calm mission for an experienced professional. The diary begins with a description of the embarkation. The morning was sunny, and the passengers, mostly upper-middle-class couples and families, were smiling as they boarded, with cameras hanging around their necks and eyes shining with anticipation. Raphael described everything with an attentive but distant gaze. There was something about him that seemed too observant, as if he were trying to record not only the facts, but the energy of the environment. The smell of the sea air, the muffled sound of footsteps on the wooden deck, the broad smiles accompanied by anxious conversations. Everything was noted with precision and sensitivity. In the first few paragraphs, he revealed a certain enchantment with the ship. The Atlantis, although not the most modern in the fleet, had a classic elegance. The long, red-carpeted corridors, the crystal chandeliers that swayed gently with the movement of the waves, the library hidden behind a false door in the main salon. Everything had a charm that seemed to have been plucked from another time. "There is a soul in this ship," wrote Raphael. "I'm not talking about a spirit in the usual sense. I'm referring to the impression that everything here has a memory, as if the walls held secrets and smiles from those who have passed through them." The first day of the voyage passed without incident. The passengers settled into their cabins. The restaurant served dishes prepared by the French chef hired especially for that season, and the crew went about their business with quiet professionalism. Raphael described his own state of mind with a certain enchantment. He felt at peace, as if for a brief moment he had left behind the hectic world of the coast. There was something therapeutic about the rocking of the sea, the constant sound of the waves beating against the hull. He noted that he felt no desire to communicate with anyone beyond what was necessary, just to observe, just to feel. "I am rediscovering the pleasure of silence. Here, time does not flow, it breathes." At the end of the second day, while the ship continued its journey calmly across the Atlantic, Raphael wrote one last line before going to sleep. "I still don't know why I took this job. Maybe it was fate that brought me here, or maybe it's this ship that chose me." Closing the diary, he smelled the salty air coming through his cabin window. The sea outside was calm. The sky was clear. The moon lit the waves with a serene glow. Everything was peaceful. But, as we learn throughout life, sometimes it is in the most absolute silence that the first whisper hides. The following days on the Atlantida cruise continued as serene as the first pages of Raphael's diary suggested. The sea, like a liquid mirror, reflected the blue sky without interruption. It was a silent, infinite vastness that seemed to welcome the ship with an almost maternal gentleness. The ship sailed as if it were cradled in the arms of nature itself. Raphael kept his diary as a ritual. Every night, after making his last round, he would return to the cabin, turn on the small desk lamp, and write. The reports were detailed, but always calm, like someone describing a long, peaceful dream. The sea does not speak. It breathes, and when it takes a deep breath, we feel it in the hull. A slight oscillation, like a whisper that runs through the entire vessel. On the third day, he devoted a few pages to describing the behavior of the waters. He was an attentive, almost poetic man. He observed the movement of the waves, the way they beat against the side of the ship in rhythm, and how the sound became a kind of background music for everyone on board. During meals, passengers commented on how perfect the trip was. No seasickness, no delays, no storms. Children ran through the aisles as if the ship were a floating playground. Couples took photos with the sea in the background, smiling and framed by the breeze. There was a diffuse joy in the air, a feeling that everyone was experiencing something rare. "The calm is sometimes so constant that we forget to doubt it," Raphael wrote one night. "But I remain vigilant. Peace can also be a kind of mask." Even with all the lightness of the days, Raphael never lost his habit of walking alone on the deck after midnight. At those times, he described the environment differently, more intimate, more silent. The moonlight created long shadows between the empty chairs. The stars, more visible far from the coast, seemed to surround the ship on all sides. "I like to walk when everyone is asleep. That's when the ship reveals its true personality. It creaks, sighs, breathes along with me." On one of these nighttime walks, something caught his attention for the first time. It wasn't a loud noise or a striking event, just the absence of something. The sound of the waves seemed more subdued, as if the sea had momentarily held its breath. He stopped near the bow, looked at the horizon, and wrote, "Everything is so calm, too calm." And for the first time, I felt that maybe this calm wasn't a gift, maybe it was a warning. But that very night, nothing unusual happened. The ship continued on its way. The stars continued to shine, and the diary was closed with the same delicacy as always, like someone cradling a thought before going to sleep. The next morning, the passengers gathered on deck again for breakfast. Laughter, colorful juices, croissants. Children played, couples hugged, staff smiled kindly. Everything was in perfect order. Everything seemed normal. But Raphael, although kindly, began to write with less certainty. The ship keeps smiling, but there's something behind its eyes that makes me want to tread more carefully. At dawn on the 5th day, Raphael woke up suddenly. There were no screams, no knocking on the door. Not even the sudden rocking of the ship that could have shaken him from his sleep. What woke him, as he himself described in his diary, was a sensation. Something faint, as if a thought had crept into his mind before his eyes had even opened. He woke with the impression that he was no longer alone in his cabin. He lay there for a few seconds, listening. Nothing but the rhythmic sound of the sea. He stood up, still silent, and turned on the small lamp on the table. The cabin was as it always was at night. Curtains drawn, books stacked in the corner, uniform, folded over the chair. But even so, he noted, there was something in the air. A presence. Not threatening, just watchful. Raphael walked slowly to the door, unlocked it, and peered into the hallway. It was empty, as expected. The low lights of the lamps made the carpet reddish with golden hues. Everything was silent. But there was a slight chill, unusual, even for the early hours of the morning. A different air, not coming from the ventilation system. He went back, inside, and, unable to sleep again, decided to take one of his nightly walks. This time, he felt a strange need for silence, not calm, but tense, as if he was afraid of waking something that he didn't yet know was asleep. On deck, everything seemed the same. The sky was clear, the sea calm, but the silence was thicker than ever. It was then that Raphael noticed. At the far end of the deck, near the railing, someone was standing. A silhouette, motionless. It was hard to see, but it was a tall man, wearing something that looked like an old-fashioned uniform, like the first models worn on ocean liners in the 1940s. The face was not visible. The figure was turned away, looking out to sea. Raphael frowned. There was no one registered for patrol at that time except him. And security guards usually wore more modern, visible clothing and equipment. That didn't make sense. I approached slowly, not intending to scare him. But when I got about 10 steps away, he was no longer there. There was no sound of footsteps, no running, no sudden movement, just emptiness, the kind of disappearance that is not an escape, but a dematerialization. Raphael stood still for a moment, staring at the same spot in the sea where the figure had been. And in that instant, something subtle happened. The waves changed direction, very lightly, as if a contrary tide were trying to rise. He walked back to the cabin in silence, without speaking to anyone. In his diary, he wrote precisely, "There are presences here. I don't know if they are human. I don't know if they belong to this time, but I didn't feel afraid. Just the impression of having been included in something that existed before me." The next morning, Raphael went about his usual routine. No one mentioned anything strange. The passengers were talking about the previous night's show, a small musical show with a pianist and dancers. Everyone seemed fine, happy, at peace. But Raphael noticed the details. A passenger who stared at the sea for a long time, without blinking. Waiter who was muttering something to himself, as if he was talking to someone absent. A boy who drew eyes. On all his sheets of paper, everything was discreet. Everything was subtle. But something had changed in Atlantis. The ship was still sailing smoothly. But now, Raphael knew, he was not alone in the early hours. The following night, Raphael continued his silent routine. He no longer walked out of habit or pleasure, but out of necessity. Something inside him asked him to be awake when everyone else was asleep. Perhaps an ancient intuition, like those that sailors used to respect without ever questioning. He was not a man of superstition, but he had grown up near the sea, and he learned early on that certain things you simply feel. The dawn was as serene as the previous ones. The sky was still cloudless, the moon cut through the darkness with its pale light, and the sea stretched out like an immense dark silk. The Cruzeiro Atlantida continued floating gently, almost without sound. But, for Raphael, the night had gained a new kind of texture, a silence that seemed to hide something just below its surface. And then he listened. It was as he walked alone along the upper deck, near the observation wing. The corridors there were almost always deserted at that time. But that morning, the silence was broken by a sound that shouldn't have been there. Whispers, low, dragging, coming from somewhere ahead, but with no clear source. It was as if the air itself was murmuring. Raphael stopped walking. He tried to identify words, but there was no comprehensible sentence, only scattered syllables, broken breaths, as if someone was talking to someone else. And the answer never came. The sound was like the wind, but the wind does not repeat names. He wasn't sure what he heard, but he noted that for a few seconds, the whisper seemed to say his own name, Raphael, stretched, light, almost like a sigh filled with an inexplicable longing. He walked slowly to the end of the hallway. He opened one of the double glass doors that led to the outside deck. The air was cold, but not biting. The moon reflected off the wooden floor with a pale glow, and the lounge chairs were perfectly aligned as if no one had ever used them. But the whispers continued, now further behind him. He turned around at once. The corridor was empty. No footsteps, no shadows, only the soft hum of electric light and the quiet creak of the ship. Yet he was sure the whispers had moved. They were not coming from a fixed point. They were accompanied. I stopped for a few seconds and tried to listen more carefully. The sounds weren't coming from anywhere in particular. They were all around me, like a mist. Interestingly, Raphael reported that he felt no fear. His heart didn't race. There was something calm about the presence. Frightening, yes, but wrapped in a strange peace. He described it as if someone was trying to tell him a long-forgotten secret, not to scare him, but to finally be heard. He stood there for a few minutes, with his eyes closed, listening to the whispers fade into the air. And when he opened them again, everything was as before. The ship was still, the sea was calm, the sky was clear. The next morning, he tried to find some logical explanation. He checked the sound systems. He spoke discreetly with other officers. No irregular noises had been recorded. No one else had heard anything unusual, but that same day, during lunch, an elderly lady, the passenger in cabin 422, commented to one of the chambermaids, "Last night, someone spoke to me in the dark. But it wasn't a dream. It was real. They were whispering, but they were sad." The chambermaid laughed, thinking it was just a mix-up of age. But Raphael, who was passing by at the time, didn't laugh. He just mentally noted the cabin number, and he wrote in his diary, "Whatever is here, it doesn't wish us harm, but it wants to be heard. It wants to be remembered." The crossing was calm, without any deviations, but at night, When everyone was asleep, the ship began to speak, and Raphael now listened. On the 7th night of the crossing, the sky was darker than usual. No stars. The moon seemed covered by a thin layer of mist, although there was no sign of clouds. The sea, however, remained incredibly calm, as if holding its breath. And the Cruzeiro Atlantida, with its silent glow, continued to cut through that dark immensity with the delicacy of an enchanted ship. Raphael didn't feel tired. In fact, he had barely slept since the whispers. There was something inside him that was pulsing, a gentle restlessness, not desperate, but constant, as if he were waiting for something. Not a threat, but a revelation. He went up on deck around 2 in the morning, as he always did. The chairs were empty, slightly damp from the sea air. The air was thick, cold, and there was a subtle smell of iron, as if the sea beneath the tranquility was bleeding. That's when he noticed. At first he thought it was a reflection from the boat itself. But the lights were coming from underwater. They wavered, small and delicate, like fireflies moving beneath the surface. They were bluish, almost translucent, and seemed to dance slowly, in patterns that resembled the movements of underwater hands. Raphael approached the edge of the ship and looked more closely. The lights were there, a few meters deep, following the cruise. There was no defined shape, no noise, just those points of light that approached and moved away, as if they were curious. They weren't schools of fish. They weren't ordinary marine bioluminescence. They were moving as if they were watching me. He stood there for long minutes, feeling mesmerized. Little by little, some lights began to rise a little higher. They touched the surface of the water without breaking it. They shone more brightly. One of them remained still for a few moments, directly below where he was standing. It was as if it was calling to him. I thought of everything it could be, reflection, gas, plankton. But deep down, I knew. It wasn't the sea. It was the ship. Raphael's mind began to stitch together signs, the whispers, the missing figure, the eyes drawn by the children. Now, lights coming from deep within, approaching like silent visitors. He didn't move away. Instead, he sat on the edge of the nearest chair and remained there, as if it was all natural. A slow unfolding of an ancient story that he was finally allowed to witness. Minutes later, the lights began to fade, first slowly, then faster, until they disappeared completely into the blackness of the sea. Raphael looked around. There was no one there. The world was still, and only the Atlantis sailed, like a ghost gliding between the boundaries of the real and the unsaid. Later, in the cabin, he wrote calmly, "The lights were alive, or at least aware. They seemed to invite. I didn't feel afraid. I felt familiarity." The next morning, he met a boy in the hallway whom he had seen before. He was holding a drawing made with blue crayon. In it, there was a ship floating on the dark sea, and just below it, dozens of small lights, drawn in flickering circles, all with lines leading to the ship. "They like to play with us," the boy said, smiling, before running towards his mother. Raphael didn't ask anything. He just observed. And that night, he decided to write one more line. "The sea does not want to swallow us. It wants to show us, but it needs silence and open eyes." The tranquility remained. The ship continued. But Raphael no longer felt like he was on a normal cruise. Something was stirring inside him, and the sea seemed ready to reveal, little by little, everything that had been submerged in time. On the morning of the 8th day, Raphael woke with a strange sense of confusion, not the kind that comes after a poorly remembered dream, but the kind that sets in when reality seems to have small continuity errors, as if something had subtly changed overnight, without fanfare. Something he couldn't prove, but he knew was different. The breakfast routine was as usual. Attentive waiters, delicately served dishes, the soft aroma of fresh bread and coffee mingling with the distant sound of the sea. But Raphael noticed new faces, people who, as far as he remembered, had not boarded with the others. They weren't typical tourists. They didn't wear straw hats or take pictures. They were alone, silent, and dressed too modestly for a cruise ship. There was a man in a dark suit sitting by a window, reading a newspaper dated 1979. A young woman with very long hair was stirring her tea in slow, circular motions, staring into the liquid, as if she was waiting for him to say something. I haven't seen them before, I'm sure, and I didn't find their names on the cabin lists. He didn't act immediately. He just observed, as he had done from the beginning. He spent the day moving discreetly through the hallways, stairwells, and halls. In every room there seemed to be one or two faces that didn't belong on the lists. Some people interacted with them without noticing anything strange. Others seemed to avoid them, as if they had a vague instinct that something was wrong but couldn't explain what. In the ship's library, the quietest and least visited place, Raphael found them again. The man in the suit was leafing through a book of nautical records from the 1960s, his expression blank. When Raphael approached, the man looked up for a moment and murmured in a low voice, "This ship has traveled this route before, many years ago." Raphael tried to ask his name. The man smiled slightly, closed the book, and left it on the table, on. The back cover there was an inscription erased in pencil, "For those who come after me." Raphael leafed through the book. Inside, he found old newspaper clippings, all reporting disappearances at sea, missing cruises, people who never returned. A strange pattern, dates always close to March, routes similar to the one they were doing. Now, it was as if Atlantis was repeating something. Late in the afternoon, Raphael did something he didn't usually do. He went to the communications booth and discreetly asked the officer in charge if there was any way to check the updated passenger list. The man laughed, not understanding the reason for the request, but authorized it. Raphael compared. Line by line, no new names, no recent additions. They are here, but they are not registered. That night, as he wrote, his hands were shaking, slightly. Atlantis isn't just taking the living. There are others here, walking the halls, watching. They're not trying to hide. They're just pretending to belong. Despite everything, Raphael felt no fear. But there was something deeper now. A veiled understanding. A slowly growing suspicion. The ship was, somehow, crossing more than seas. It was crossing borders, between times, between existences, as if it were a meeting point for unfinished stories. Before closing the diary, he left a note. Some people didn't board the Atlantis. They were called. Maybe, just like me. That night, as he lay in bed, he heard footsteps outside his cabin, soft, light steps, as if someone were barefoot. They didn't stop. They just walked, in circles. And then, a soft whisper, "You will also forget." In the silence that followed, Raphael took a deep breath, and he fell asleep, slowly, like someone surrendering to the sound of the sea. The first time the button appeared, Raphael thought it was fatigue. It was late afternoon, and he had spent the last few hours reviewing old blueprints of the ship. The original design of the Atlantis included 8 habitable decks, numbered 0 through 7, all accessible by stairs and elevators. There was no mention of a 9th level, but that afternoon, when he pressed the main elevator button, he saw something strange. Among the usual floors, a button appeared that he had never noticed before. The button was there, dimly lit, discreet, between the pool level, deck 7, and the sauna level, deck 8, as if he was there all along, just waiting for someone to notice him. Raphael didn't press, not at that moment. He went down to deck 2 and made his rounds as he always did, but the thought followed him, like a persistent itch. "Deck 13?" he repeated in his mind, as if the words held some hidden meaning. The number itself carried weight, the famous unlucky number avoided by superstitious hotels, buildings, and ships. But Raphael was not a man to be impressed by superstition. He was methodical, careful. And this was a mistake. A real physical mistake. Something that shouldn't be there. At dawn, he returned. The elevator was empty, the lights were soft. The panel, as before, displayed the usual numbers, but when he ran his finger lightly over the buttons, there it was, 13, again illuminated. Almost like an invitation. I waited. I tried to rationalize. It could be a system error, a glitch in the dashboard, but then it blinked, once, as if it had noticed my presence. Raphael took a deep breath and squeezed. The elevator made no sound, no sudden vibrations. It just began to descend, silently, past the lowest known floor. The internal display no longer showed the numbers, and the descent time was too long. More than a minute. Finally, with a subtle click, the doors opened. The hallway ahead was not dark, but not well lit either. A faint amber light came from the ceiling, as if the room was enveloped in a soft shadow. The walls had a different covering than the rest of the ship, older, worn, with ornamental details not found on any other floor. It was a hidden floor, and it was active. Raphael took a few steps, trying to hear his own footsteps, but the floor seemed to muffle the sound. There was no one in sight. The bedroom doors were closed, and there was something curious about all of them. None of them had numbers. It was as if this floor existed, but not to be found. Or perhaps it existed only for those who sought it. On the wall to his left, he saw a crooked picture. Inside, an old portrait of crew members he had never seen before. Uniforms from decades ago, faces faded by time, but all looking in the same direction, not at the camera, but at something to the right. Out of frame, and below the image, a small sign. The last crossing must not be interrupted. Raphael didn't understand the meaning, yet, but he could feel the gravity of it, the density of the place, as if Deck 13 were a waiting place, a way station, neither alive nor dead, just suspended, decided to return. He walked back to the elevator and pressed the up button. The display is working again, and as if nothing had happened, the panel showed only the normal floors, from 0 to 8, no 13. That night, in his diary, he wrote, "Deck 13 exists, and it's not in the blueprints, it's not in logic, it's on the other side of the ship, where the things that shouldn't be seen wait." In the morning, he tried to return. He pressed all the buttons. He repeated the route. But button 13 was no longer there. It had disappeared. Or maybe it was just hiding again, waiting for the next night, waiting for the next curious person. Before going to sleep, Raphael wrote, "One more loose line. Atlantis has more floors than it looks, and not all of them lead up." The 9th day of the journey dawned gray. There was no rain, no strong wind, just a thin mist that lay over the sea like a damp, silent sheet. The sky seemed lower, as if pressing the ship against the ocean. The temperature had dropped slightly, and the cruiser Atlantis seemed to be moving more slowly than usual, although the instruments indicated normal speed. Raphael spent the morning trying to get back into the swing of things. He checked the common areas, checked crew reports, and greeted passengers with his usual kindness. But deep down, he knew something had changed. The previous night had left its mark on him. Deck 13 never left his mind. That wasn't just a structural error, it was a space outside of common reality, a place that did not exist in the logic of the records, but that revealed itself when logic grew tired of maintaining appearances. And then the doors began. It was a discreet, almost imperceptible phenomenon. At first, one of the crew members casually reported that his cabin had locked itself during the night. He thought it was wind or some electrical fault. But that same day, another employee said the same thing. Then, a passenger. The doors locked. From the inside, without warning, without sound. And when anyone tried to force them or use the master key, the mechanism seemed to jam, as if the ship would not allow entry. Today, 3 doors closed by themselves. And no one saw who locked them. Sometimes, they seemed to be waiting for someone specific to open them, as if they were obeying a silent order. Raphael decided to investigate for himself. That night, he walked the halls with a clipboard in his hand, noting which doors had been reported as rebellious. He stopped in front of one of them, cabin 307, and waited. For almost an hour, he stood there without making a sound, until, without any warning, the doorknob slowly turned. Alone. The door closed with a click, as if someone inside had turned the lock. Raphael approached, tried to open it. It was locked. He knocked softly. No one answered. And yet he felt it. On the other side there was someone, or something. The doors don't move on their own, but these don't seem to obey ordinary physics. It's as if Atlantida had a mind of its own, as if it were redrawing its internal boundaries, creating new spaces, new limits, new silences. Other crew members began to notice strange behavior. One of the security guards claimed to have passed through a hallway 3 times in a row, and each time he saw the same door open and close softly, even though the room was windless. A flight attendant heard footsteps behind a closed door, but the cabin had been empty for days. But the most disturbing report came from the maintenance technician. He said he went into one of the smaller engine rooms to check out a noise, and, when he tried to get out, the door was just gone, not locked, gone, plain wall in place. He knocked, he yelled, but there was no echo. He said he was stuck there for 20 minutes before the door reappeared. This happened on Deck 5, but the time inside the room seemed longer, as if I had lived there for hours in absolute silence. Raphael began to mark the most active ports. He circled them with a red pen on his clipboard. And little by little, he noticed a pattern. They were spreading. They started in isolated cabins. Then they appeared in utility rooms, and now, a door in the infirmary had locked by itself with a nurse inside. She screamed that she could see shadows moving beneath the crack, but no one outside could hear her. When they managed to open it, the woman was huddled in the corner, her eyes fixed on the door, muttering, "They're outside now. Waiting. That night, Raphael wrote down with a steady hand. The doors are becoming sentient, or they obey something that is moving between the decks, something that knows our schedules, our names, our fears. And before closing the diary, he added, "I'm beginning to feel like the ship is testing who can stay and who should be left behind." On the 10th night, Raphael dreamed. But it wasn't an ordinary dream, not one of those vague, disjointed ones that you lose sight of the next morning. It was a lucid, immersive dream where everything seemed absolutely real. The smell, the texture of the floor beneath your feet, the sound of your footsteps echoing in metal corridors. It was as if you were awake in another part of the ship, a ship that existed only when your eyes closed. He was walking alone through an area he didn't recognize. The walls looked older than any part of Atlantis I had ever explored. The peeling paint revealed layers of rust that seemed alive, pulsing in the dim, flickering light. The air was thick, saturated with a strong smell of sea air and rusty iron. It was the smell of time, or perhaps of abandonment. The lights flickered, but they never went out completely. In the dream, Raphael passed doors with round windows, like portholes, and behind these windows he saw motionless silhouettes. Some were sitting, some were standing. None of them moved, but they all seemed to be looking at him, even though their faces were always hidden in shadow. The shadows saw me. and I felt like they knew my name, even if they never said it. There was a cadence in the hallways. The sound of his own footsteps echoed as if they were echoing behind him, or as if someone else was stepping right behind him with the same rhythm. At one point, he passed in front of a crooked mirror, hanging by only one hook. The reflection he saw was not his own. It was him, but older. Sunken eyes, worn uniform, skin marked by something that seemed to have been cold for too long. And behind the reflection, inside the mirror, a still figure. Raphael woke up with his heart beating, slowly, as if he was still stuck on what he saw. The cabin was dark, the air more humid than it should have been, and there was something subtle about it, a smell, not of perfume, not of dirt, but of salt and rust, the same smell as the dream. I never smelled that odor inside the Atlantis, until today. He stood up, turned on the soft light on his desk, and opened the diary. The words came slowly, as if they needed careful writing. I don't know where I was last night, but I was part of the ship, or maybe a part of it that exists only when we sleep. A worn-out, forgotten, but alive version. The next morning, the crew's behavior was different. Many reported insomnia, nightmares. One of the engineers had a mild collapse and asked to be taken off duty, claiming that the ship is turning inside out when we close our eyes, and discreetly, a chambermaid was seen cleaning the door of an isolated cabin, whispering softly as she wiped it, "Don't let the rust in anymore. Don't let it. Raphael, as a precaution, went to the vessel's old records. He discovered that before being called Atlantis, the ship had another name, Atlantic Fog, and had been built on the wreckage of a 1940s freighter, a freighter, that sank after a mysterious explosion during a storm. Among the items recovered were reports of voices heard in the hold and dreams shared among crew members days before the accident. The pattern was repeating itself. We are not dreaming different things. We are dreaming together. And before closing that entry, Raphael wrote something in firm handwriting, as if he no longer had any doubts. The Atlantis is not just at sea. It is between states of consciousness. It sails through time, yes, but also through memory. And when we fall asleep, perhaps we are taken to where the ship really lives. That night, he decided he would try something different. I would sleep intentionally, with the diary open next to the bed, with eyes closed and the name of the ship on the tip of your tongue, like someone knocking on the door, and wait for her to finally open up. On the morning of the 11th day, the sound of the ship seemed more hollow. It was difficult to explain. The engines still pulsed softly. The sea remained calm, and the usual sounds of dishes, conversations, and footsteps were still there. But Raphael noticed that the sound somehow echoed more, as if the hallways were bigger or emptier. In the dining room, the looks were different. Less conversation, fewer smiles. A veiled atmosphere hung in the air, something that no one could name, but everyone seemed to notice. The employees acted with redoubled attention, some whispering among themselves, others walking more quickly than usual. That day, Raphael didn't have to wait long to understand. A young passenger, just over 20 years old, was missing. Her cabin had been found tidy. Her clothes were folded, her personal belongings in order, her bed perfectly made. The strange thing was the closet. It was ajar, as if someone had opened it from the inside, even though the only way in was from the front. There were no signs of violence, no suitcases missing, no evidence that she had ever left the ship. She was simply gone. An absence that leaves no trace is always more frightening than an obvious crime. The technical team began a security check. All the cameras near the corridor where the cabin was located were analyzed, and that's when the most disturbing detail emerged. At around 3:43 a.m., the previous morning, the system recorded something. The young woman appears walking along the external deck, alone. The fog was thick, and she seems to move as if she were listening to a voice ahead, tilting her face slightly, as if trying to hear better. She stops near the security fence. Place your hands on the metal, and then the recording fails. For exactly 12 seconds, the video remains static. When the image returns, the young woman is no longer there. No fall recorded, no movement visible. Only the fog dancing in the darkness, as if there had never been any presence in that space. The failure was clean, digitally silent, as if the system itself refused to remember. Raphael went to the recording location. The deck was calm, as always. But he noticed something curious on the ground. A light mark of bare footprints, still damp, that headed towards the edge, and didn't come back. He approached the shore. The sea was clear, still as a lake. And then he noticed something strange. Underwater, for just a few seconds, blue lights, the same ones from days ago, glimmered. 3, maybe 4. They seemed to be rising, or waiting. She was called, and she answered. That night, Raphael did not write right away. He spent a long time just looking at the diary, reflecting. Then, in firm handwriting, he wrote the following words. Atlantis is choosing, not cruelly, but with intent. Those who listen, those who allow themselves to feel, are perhaps being invited, or taken. She didn't fall. She crossed. At dinner, no one spoke of the young woman. No announcements. No absence was officially noted. She had disappeared. But the ship seemed to act as if she had never been there. It was at this moment that Raphael noticed something even more disturbing. There was a new passenger in the dining room, an elderly man in gray clothes sitting alone, eating slowly, and he was sitting exactly where the young lady used to sit. Atlantida adapts. It changes faces. It replaces presences naturally, as if the living and those who have already departed were pieces of the same floating puzzle. On the last line of the page, Raphael wrote, "The first fall was not an end, it was a beginning. And I fear I am no longer on the sidelines, I am also being watched." And when he closed the diary that night, he felt, for the first time since he had boarded the ship, that the cabin was too small, as if the ship was approaching, inside. At dawn on the 12th day, Raphael woke up to a sound he couldn't immediately identify. It wasn't a loud noise. It was something subtle, continuous, almost hypnotic, like a muffled chant coming from far away. It wasn't coming from the cabin next door or from the hallways. It was deeper, as if it was passing through the walls, as if it was rising from within the sea itself. He sat up slowly in bed, breathing evenly. The light on the lamp beside him flickered once. It didn't go out, it just flickered, as if confirming that something was indeed different that night. It remained silent for a few minutes, and the sound was right there. It wasn't a groan. Nor was it the sound of machinery or the creaking of the hull. It was something more organic, a lilting whisper like a melody made of consonants. It was like a language, but a language that didn't seem made for human voices. The sea is speaking, but it is not speaking to us. It is repeating something very old. Raphael walked carefully to the cabin's balcony. He gently opened the glass door and peered out at the ocean. The water was restless, not violent, but rippling strangely, as if it were breathing. The sky was still covered in mist, and the sound, it was louder here. He leaned over the railing, and, with calm astonishment, he realized that the sound came from the waves. The waves themselves, as they broke against the hull, formed words. Not in Portuguese, not in English. They were phonemes that seemed alive, as if the sea were declaiming something, a prayer perhaps, or a summons. I imagined I was hearing things, but no, there was rhythm. There was repetition, a sequence of liquid syllables whispered like secrets beneath the surface. He closed his eyes, and for a moment he felt welcomed. The sound didn't cause fear. It caused a kind of reverence, as if he were too small to understand, but still, he was being tolerated there, like a guest, like someone who, even though he wasn't part of the house, had been allowed to stay. At that moment, an image appeared in his mind, as vivid as a flash. An underwater hall, a vast space with ancient columns lit only by the same blue lights he had seen at the bottom of the sea. Within it, figures stood still, motionless. But their eyes, they were all open. They were listening too. All of them. And the sound was coming from above. From me. Raphael stepped back, panting but not scared. It was as if part of him had been submerged, even though he hadn't moved. As if Atlantis was becoming a bridge, not between lands, but between planes, between layers of existence. The sea whispers, but not to everyone. Only those who have learned to listen without fear can hear it. During breakfast, Raphael walked through the halls in silence. The usual voices had died down. Many passengers stared out the window, silent. There was a strange harmony between them, as if they shared a secret they dared not say out loud. A child walked past him, dragging a teddy bear. When they met eyes, she said, "They've been rehearsing for a long time. You heard it too, right?" Raphael froze. He didn't answer. The child just smiled slightly, turned, and continued walking, disappearing down a hallway. Later, revisiting the security cameras out of curiosity, Raphael discovered something that gave him goosebumps. During the early hours of the morning, almost 30 passengers were awake at the same time. Some on the balconies, others on the decks, a few in the corridors. All of them were motionless, looking out to sea. The sound wasn't just for me. They heard it too. Atlantis is synchronizing hearts, preparing something. On the last page of that night's diary, he wrote something carefully, almost as if he was afraid of attracting attention. There is a language that is not human, but that is within us. It sleeps, quiet, like a seed. And the ship is the rain that makes it grow. Before going to sleep, he left the balcony open. The sound was still there, light as a breath between the waves, like a prayer being repeated eternally, waiting to be understood. And as he closed his eyes, one last sentence echoed in his mind, spoken not with words, but with intention. "You're already on your way." On the 13th day, something unexpected disturbed the ship's silent routine, and curiously, no one seemed really surprised. It was a detail, one of those that would go unnoticed by the distracted eye, but not by Raphael. He had walked to the dining room just after noon, as he did almost every day. But when he pushed open the double doors with their usual subtle creak, something was wrong. The hallway was different. The slope of the floor, the type of carpet, the paint on the walls, it all seemed to belong on another deck, and yet there was the dining room. With the same tables, the same neatly lined-up cutlery, the jugs of juice on silver trays, the smiling waiters, passengers sitting, eating and chatting calmly. But Raphael knew that part of the ship well. The room simply couldn't be there. I've passed it hundreds of times. At that point, there's just a reading room. And yet today, there was silverware clanking against plates and soft music playing in the background. Confused, he turned around. He walked back down the previous corridor. He checked the signs. The ship's map, pinned to the wall, confirmed it. He was on deck 4. And indeed, there he was, should not have a dining room. But when he returned and opened the doors again, the hall was gone. Instead, there was only the usual reading room. Silent. Abandoned. Empty chairs, forgotten books on the table. The same door, 2 different destinations. And I didn't change places. It was the ship that changed. That afternoon, Raphael walked around the other decks. Little by little, he began to notice a pattern. The ship was reconfiguring itself. Rooms were appearing in unexpected places. A towel closet that used to be next to the laundry room was now inside the infirmary. An emergency exit that led to the pool took him directly to a corridor of cabins that day. Everything, however, happened with disconcerting naturalness. Whoever noticed kept quiet. Who didn't understand? He kept smiling and serving desserts. During the official dinner, served on deck 2, Raphael sat near the window, observing the faces around him. Some were pale, as if they hadn't slept in days. Others were intensely silent, stirring their food without tasting it. And there were those who smiled serenely, as if they had accepted a greater truth. Change is not sudden, it is gentle. Like the ship itself, it does not force us to see, it just changes, little by little, and those who notice it start to live at a different pace. One of the waiters approached him discreetly. He was young and always polite, but that night, he seemed distant, his eyes slightly moist. He stopped beside the table and whispered, almost as if he were confessing a secret. "Sometimes she's up there. Sometimes she's down here. The room changes places. When someone needs to remember something." Raphael looked up, surprised. "Remember what?" The boy just smiled, placed a folded napkin on the table, and walked away. Inside the napkin, Raphael found something he hadn't seen in days, the missing young woman's identification pin. The same one from deck 3. It was clean, as if it had been recently polished, but slightly warm to the touch. The room is alive. It moves like a heart. Inside the ship, a heart that carries memories. And that, from time to time, needs to position itself where the memory can be felt. That night, Raphael did not dream. But when he opened the diary, he felt that he did not need to report anything, not in ordinary words. He wrote a single sentence. The ship changes place because we are also changing inside. He closed the diary, and for the first time, he didn't feel lost. He felt part of the path. On the night of the 14th day, the sky was clear, until it wasn't. Raphael went up on deck around 3 a.m. The sea was calm, the air warm, and there was no wind. Everything seemed suspended, as if time had stopped to listen to what would come next. He no longer walked cautiously. He walked with familiarity, as if the ship belonged to him, or as if he no longer belonged to anything outside of it. It was then that he saw. As he looked up at the sky, where he usually saw stars, something new appeared, a dark, dense smudge moving slowly over the ship. It wasn't a cloud, it was alive. A tight group of birds, hundreds of them, maybe thousands, flying in perfect circles, like a swirl of ink against the veil of night. I have never seen birds so far from the coast, and definitely never so many, and never so silent. They didn't squawk. They didn't make any sound. They just spun around, slowly, as if drawing invisible symbols on the cruise ship. Raphael remained motionless, leaning against the railing on the upper deck, his eyes fixed on the movement, and then, with a slight shudder of the air, they stopped. They remained suspended in the sky for a few seconds, floating like shadows, motionless, in a perfect geometric pattern, as if they were waiting for an order, or as if they were observing. They were no ordinary birds. Their movements obeyed something beyond instinct. There was intention in their flights. There was consciousness. An even denser silence fell over the ship. No engines, no footsteps, no creaking. Even the sound of the sea seemed to have receded. Raphael realized then that he was not alone on deck. Other passengers had boarded as well, 12, maybe 15. All of them were standing still, silent, staring up at the sky like him, as if they had been summoned, as if the birds were a long-awaited sign. And then, Like a breath, the birds began to descend. Not in attack, not in haste, but like a dark curtain sliding from the heavens. Some landed on the ropes, others on the masts, on the windowsills, on the hull's edges. They filled the ship as if they had always belonged there. Dark eyes, motionless. No sound. They seemed to recognize the ship, as if they had been here before, as if they were messengers, not creatures. At that moment, something peculiar happened. Raphael felt his body become light. Not exactly floating, but disconnected from its usual weight, as if he were suspended. The air in his lungs seemed denser, but still soft. His mind was clear, but in a liminal state, between waking and what comes after dreaming. I felt that if I looked into any of those black eyes, I would see my own story being told in a language I did not know, and suddenly everything went back to normal. The birds took flight all at once, like a single creature breathing in reverse. They spiraled upward, higher and higher, until they became a dark line in the sky, and disappeared altogether. The passengers slowly returned to their cabins without saying a word. No one seemed scared, just touched. That morning, Raphael wrote little, but the words came with a strange beauty. They came to see. They came to remember. They came to keep alive what the Atlantis carries. They are the eyes of the sky for the ship that crosses what is not visible. Before going to sleep, he looked at the reflection of the sea through the window, and for a moment, just a moment, he thought there were black feathers floating on the waves. Everything is observed. Everything is known. The crossing is being monitored. And for the first time, he didn't fear the end. On the morning of the 15th day, Raphael woke up before the alarm went off. But when he looked at the bedside clock, he realized that it didn't tell any time. The face was intact. The glass was clean. The numbers were clearly visible. But the hands were gone, not broken, not fallen off, just missing. At first, he thought it was an isolated glitch. He got up, his eyes still heavy from a deep, memoryless sleep, and went to the small wall clock next to the door. The same, dial intact, numbers in their places, but no hands. Clocks without hands do not count time. They suspend it. Intrigued, he walked through the corridors of the ship. On every floor, in every common room, he checked the clocks, in the lounges, in the corridors, in the library, in the dining room. Everyone had lost their pointers, and the strangest thing, no one seemed to notice. Activities continued as normal. Passengers came and went with their cups of coffee, staff tidied up cabins, lights were on, and meals were served punctually, but without time. Raphael looked at his own wrist. His digital clock had also stopped, not reset, just frozen. 0303, the 3 digits, motionless, fixed, like an eternity that refuses to pass. It was then that he understood. The Atlantis was not just crossing the sea. It was, little by little, leaving time behind. Time, the most discreet of human prisons, has been suspended, as if the ship were saying, now, only what matters is what you feel, not what has passed, not what will come. During lunch, the head chef commented humorlessly that he had burned 2 loaves of bread in the oven. The timer hadn't gone off. One crew member dozed for 10 minutes and woke up 2 hours later. A lady swore she had seen the sun set twice in the same day. And among all these reports, there was a common feeling. No one felt tired, neither hungry nor sleepy. It was as if the body was in a suspended state, obeying its own logic. The clock has stopped, but the heart continues, and the ship, too. In the library, Raphael found a book that wasn't there before. An old, untitled volume with a worn leather cover and the unmistakable smell of old paper. When he opened it, he found a single sentence, handwritten, right in the center of the first page. Time yields to those who stop looking for it. That night, Raphael's cabin looked different, not in the furniture, but in the air, lighter, as if the internal space had expanded, as if the absence of time had released a kind of silence that only exists in places where eternity refuses to move. He wrote calmly, without looking at his watch, "We are out of time, or time is out of us. And this is not punishment, it is preparation. We are being trained to live beyond the hours, to feel the crossing, not count it." He closed the diary, feeling that the days, or what was left of them, would no longer be counted as before. Now the only thing that seemed to matter was what came from the depths, from the ship, from the sea, and increasingly from within himself. When time stops, what's left is truth. In the silent darkness of the cabin, one of the emergency lights flickered 3 times in an interval that he didn't know how to measure, because there, that night, time was no longer a valid measure. On the night that seemed to have no date, Atlantida announced a special event. A discreet notice was left under the door of each cabin. Gala dinner, main deck, 9 p.m. There was no date, no reason. That's all. White letters on dark paper, as if the message itself was whispering. The signature at the bottom came without a name. Just one symbol, a black circle crossed by a sinuous line similar to the curve of a wave. Raphael received the invitation with tense silence. He knew, deep down, that something was approaching, something definitive. Time no longer moved. The clocks had given up. The rooms changed places. Presences, human or otherwise, were confused with reality. When the ship invites, it is not out of kindness, it is out of necessity. As he descended into the ballroom, Raphael noticed that the ship seemed cleaner, more polished. The woods gleamed with an almost liquid texture. The chandeliers flickered, but not with electric light. They seemed to vibrate with a moist glow, coming from within, as if they were breathing. The hall was full. Passengers lined up, well-dressed, in formal attire I had never seen before. Some of the dresses looked like they were from another era. Clothes with ancient cuts, hand-sewn, fabrics that gleamed with a dull sheen, as if they had been sewn with time instead of thread. But the most disturbing thing was the silence. There was music. A soft, almost whispered melody seemed to float in the air, but no instrument was visible. And strangest of all, no one spoke. No laughter, no conversation. Just gentle movements, like a slow dance with existence itself. It was as if everyone was in a state of reverence, not for the party, but for something approaching. Raphael sat down. A waiter, with a very calm expression, brought a glass with a translucent liquid between white and blue. He didn't say a word. He just served and left. Looking around, Raphael recognized faces he hadn't seen since the beginning of the trip. Passengers who had disappeared days before. People he swore were no longer there. Everyone was present, and everyone looked from time to time in the same direction. The center of the room, where a long table, still empty, seemed to be waiting for guests who had not yet arrived. It was a ritual, not a dinner. Little by little, the seats at the central table began to be filled. One by one, men and women with dark eyes, soft steps, and a dense aura, as if they had come from another side of the journey. Some smiled. Others just looked ahead, as if they had a mission. And then she arrived. A tall female figure wearing a dark dress made of layers that resembled night foam. Her face was indistinct, but not because of the darkness. It was as if it were in constant motion, like the surface of the sea reflecting the sky. She walked to the table. She didn't speak. She just sat down, and at that moment, everyone stood up simultaneously. Raphael stood up too, without knowing why. His body was reacting without his mind understanding. and for a moment a new sound emerged, not words, but a vibration. A deep note, like the sound of a boat calling in the distance, piercing the fog. The entire hall seemed to tremble gently. The lights from the chandeliers vibrated. The seawater outside rose slightly, gently touching the windows. It was a call. A summons. The ship was recognizing that the moment had come. The woman in the dark dress held out a hand. In the palm, something that seemed to shine with a wet light. Raphael didn't see exactly what it was, but he knew that thing was the key, the decision, the next step. In an instant, the light in the hall went out, but nobody screamed. When the lights came back on a few seconds later, the table was empty. The guests at the center table had disappeared. Everyone else was back in their chairs, their features soft, their eyes filled with tears, but not with sadness. They looked complete. As if they had remembered something they had spent their whole lives trying to forget. Raphael wrote that night, "The ship called us to see, to remember, to be in front of what cannot be named." The party was the celebration of a cycle that is about to close. We are not the only ones on board. We never were. And before closing the diary, the crossing is coming to an end. But the end perhaps is the true beginning. The day after the party was shrouded in almost absolute silence. Not the natural silence of a ship on the open sea, but a kind of absence that seemed to hang heavy in the air. Atlantis still floated, still advanced, still moved, but everything around it seemed denser. As if the space between objects were tighter, and the time between thoughts slower. Raphael woke up without knowing how long he had slept. There was no sunlight coming through the window. No clock, no sound of footsteps. The cabin was exactly as he had left it the night before, with one difference. There was a slight dampness on the walls. Tiny drops, spread like dew, but they were inside. He touched one of them with his fingertip. Salty. The sea had somehow touched the inside of the ship, not with visible water, but with your presence. Atlantis is being filled, not by water, but by the sea itself, as if it were rising, without getting wet. As he stepped out of the cabin, Raphael noticed the phenomenon more clearly. The passages seemed narrower, the air thicker, and on every deck the same pattern. Slightly damp surfaces, muffled sounds, distorted echoes, and above all, a growing sense of pressure, not physical, but spiritual. The ship is being flooded, but the flood is not of water. It is of another layer of the sea, one that pours over the mind. As he crossed the corridor of Deck 3, he saw something curious. A painting that had previously displayed a maritime painting now showed only fog, as if the image itself had been altered by the trip. At another point on the ship, a mirror began to reflect not the corridor behind Raphael, but another space, an unknown hall, where still figures stared straight ahead. He decided to go up, to the upper deck. There he was greeted by a cold, calm wind. The sky was white, without clouds, without blue. Just a homogeneous blanket, as if the world above was also being covered by something invisible. And then he saw the water still in. The sea was below the hull, but it felt like it was surrounding him from the inside, as if the invisible layers of the ocean were infiltrating the ship, not in liquid form, but in presence. The sea does not need to flood to fill. It invades silently, through the skin, through the mind, through time. Raphael began to notice similar behavior in the other passengers. Many were sitting motionless, staring at nothing. Others walked down the aisles as if they were looking for something, but without urgency, without fear, as if they were following inaudible instructions. And then, late that afternoon, something definitely changed. A sound, low, deep, distant, ran through the ship. A low rumble, not coming from the engines. It was like the call of something immense, buried beneath the hull, slowly awakening. Raphael, standing on the deck, recognized the sound. Not because I knew him, but because I was waiting for him. The sea is approaching, it is coming in, and we are being prepared to receive it. He returned to the cabin. The walls were darker now. The mirror over the sink was no longer reflective. It showed only a calm surface of water. When he looked into it, he didn't see his face. He saw the dark sky, the horizon, and other faces, motionless, floating with their eyes open. The surface has become a portal, not between in and out, but between now and what comes next. Before going to sleep, he sat down in front of the diary. His hand hesitated, as if he felt that the words were no longer just a record, but part of the journey. He wrote, "The sea is inside the ship, and the ship is inside us. The water doesn't need to rise through our feet. It rises through our memory, through our flesh, through our surrender." And, as if obeying a silent order, he drew with the pen the symbol of the party invitation, a dark circle cut by a sinuous line. Then he closed his eyes, and the sound of the sea, which no longer came from outside, lulled him to sleep. He didn't listen to waves. He listened to answers. The next day, Raphael woke up with a feeling that was difficult to name. It wasn't fear. It wasn't peace. It was something more primal, as if his body knew the time for questions was over. Now all that was left was the silence of acceptance. The hands remained absent, the clock still, and the Atlantis kept moving, even if no one knew where it was going. The diary, which he always kept closed beside his bed, was open. This frightened him more than anything else had happened so far. Raphael knew, with all certainty, that he had closed the diary with both hands before falling asleep. But there it was, resting on the table with the pen beside it, and 2 pages filled with handwriting that was not his. The words were organized, precise, written firmly, but what disturbed him most was the fact that we're family. The crossing is the mirror of memory. Whoever observes closely returns, but only those who learn to see with the eyes that the sea offers return. The water does not want to devour. She wants to remember. Raphael reread each line with a tightness in his chest. The sentences didn't seem threatening. They weren't delusions. They were gentle truths, revealed in the voice of someone who already knows what's coming and is in no hurry to warn. At the bottom of the page, a signature, RL, last entry. Raphael, your own name, the same initials. But he hadn't written that. At least, not that day. Is it me, or is it the one who comes after me? With trembling hands, he tried to remember the moments before he fell asleep. Had he dreamed? Had he heard something? Everything seemed blank. And yet, his heart beat with the certainty that something had been transmitted while he slept. Throughout the day, more subtle manifestations occurred. Other crew members mentioned that objects were moving around. A cup that had been left on a table turned up in a cupboard. Another officer's logbook was found blank in the morning, but by late afternoon, it was filled with old notes he didn't remember writing. Atlantis is writing its stories for us, or through of us, Raphael decided to observe. For hours he left the diary open, the pen poised over the next page. He sat in the cabin chair and just listened to the sound of the ship, the creaking of the hull, the creaking of the structures, the wind in the corridors. The sea was calm, yes, but it seemed to be calm too. And then, just before the lights went out for the night, it happened. The pen moved, alone, not violently, without haste, like a leaf pushed by the lightest wind in the world. He drew a curved line, then another, formed a word: stay. Raphael approached slowly. The paint was still wet, and, just below, as if a presence had finished the thought, you are already on the right side. He closed the journal gently, but as he did so, he felt a new weight in his hands, not physical, but symbolic. The sense that he was no longer just a crewman. He was part of the ship's crew, not serving the passengers, but the ship itself. Maybe it was never me writing. Maybe Atlantida just needed willing hands. That night, before going to sleep, he put the pen aside and didn't write anything else. But when he woke up the next day, another page had been filled, and in it, a solitary sentence. The sea always writes its story in those who accept being paper. The ship seemed to breathe. Raphael woke up with this clear, constant sensation, as if he were lying inside something, alive. Not just something that moved, but something that lives, that thinks, that feels. The Atlantis was no longer just a ship. It was an entity, a silent consciousness that, for days, had revealed itself little by little, carefully, as if preparing someone for the inevitable. The cabin was the same, but not the same. The walls seemed closer. The mirror no longer showed reflections, but blurred images, like windows to other places. The empty corridors of the ship itself, filled only with an internal, pulsing fog. The air smelled of salt, but also of old paper, of unspoken words. Today is the day of departure, or arrival. The line between one thing and another no longer exists. The diary was open again, but this time Raphael knew. Whatever was written now would be the last record, not out of fear, not out of the end, but because what needed to be said had already been shown. He sat down slowly, as if he were about to sign a deal with a stranger. He picked up the pen. The hands no longer shook. The heart beat with the tranquility of someone who understood that there are seas that are only crossed once, and that, at the end of them, one does not return the same. The words came as if they had been ready inside him for a long time. Everything was written. The Atlantis does not take us from one port to another. It takes us from one state to another, from time to outside of time, from the flesh to after the flesh, and those who hear, see, feel, pass through. We didn't leave. We woke up. He paused, and he heard outside the cabin light footsteps, not in a hurry, not lost, just footsteps, as if the ship, or something inside it, was walking slowly through the corridors, visiting its parts, saying goodbye to its echoes, as if the time had come. And then Raphael wrote his last sentence. The sea calls me, and I do not go as one who surrenders. I go as one who returns. He closed the diary gently and left it on the table. He put on his uniform. He smoothed out the wrinkles as he had done on the first day. He opened the cabin door and walked out without looking back. No one else was in the hallways, not because they had disappeared, but because they had crossed over. When he reached the upper deck, the sky was a still white mass. The sea seemed made of liquid glass. There was no wind. And for a moment, everything seemed frozen, but not dead, suspended. In the center of the deck, something was waiting for him, an indistinct figure as if made of mist. It wasn't scary. It wasn't a threat. It was a welcome. It was the memory of the crossing made flesh. Raphael approached, and then, like someone who finally understands a language he always knew but never dared to speak, he heard, "Now you know," and the sea. The sea opened, not in waves, but in light. And there, in the absolute silence of a ship that no longer needed to sail, Raphael disappeared. But the diary, no. It remained on the table, waiting to be read, waiting for the next one who had the courage to listen. The Atlantis floated in silence. There were no active engines, no sails, no voices, no music, just the static presence of a ship that now seemed more like a monument than a vessel. An island forgotten by logic, floating in a part of the sea that didn't appear on maps or navigation systems. The ocean around it was a mirror, motionless, perfect, and beneath it, a sound, low, grave, like a note sustained in eternity. A group of divers, part of a rescue mission or perhaps just out of curiosity, had been sent weeks later by a vessel that had intercepted a final signal from the Atlantis before it disappeared from radar. The signal was not an emergency signal. It did not call for help. It did not indicate trouble. It was just a continuous transmission. A sound pulse, repeated hypnotically, coming from a fixed point in the middle of the ocean. The team descended with state-of-the-art equipment, cameras attached to their helmets, and oxygen under control. They expected to find wreckage, or, at most, an empty structure. But what they found defied all expectations. The Atlantis was intact, perfectly preserved, resting on a submerged elevation, as if it had anchored itself of its own accord, and inside, in the main hall, in the center of the still intact deck, the diary, closed, intact, leaning on a table as if it had been left there the night before. No sign of crew, no trace of rushing, panic, or abandonment. Nothing broken, nothing out of place. The dishes are still on display. The lights, although they were off, seemed to pulse slightly, as if the energy that powered that place was not electrical, but symbolic. The diver who picked up the journal later described it as strangely light, as if it contained not paper, but air. When I opened it, the pages were not wet, not fragile, just written. From end to end. A few lines in elegant calligraphy. Others are more shaky. Some with letters that changed shape as if they weren't made to stay still. The last page was different. She held no words. Just a mirror, glued in the center. Small, circular, with silver edges, and looking inside, the diver saw himself. But something about him was different. An older look, more tired, and behind him, in the reflection, a figure, high, static, and then everything went dark. The transmission was interrupted for exactly 33 seconds. When he returned, the diver was back on deck, journal in hand, and he said just one sentence before refusing any further descent. He woke up. The ship remains. There to this day, property untouched, like a reliquary floating in the belly of the ocean. Some say it is cursed, others that it is sacred, but those who dove deeper, they know that Atlantis is no longer adrift. He is waiting. And on the quietest nights when the wind stops and the sea sleeps, if you listen closely, you can hear the sound of pages turning. Not because anyone reads them, but why someone is still writing, and the silence of the depths is just the first line of the next diary.